So welcome back, everybody. My name is Miguel Valenzuela, and we are here at Creative Thinkers. We have a very special guest, as we do almost every time, which we have an amazing individual. Her name is Veronica Carbajal, and I welcome her because she's done a lot of amazing things in her life. Veronica, welcome.
Thank you, Miguel, for having me, for having this great show.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm glad that you took a little bit of time out of your day to talk to us because you have a lot of really interesting things to say about yourself. So we always want to start with a little bit of information about your background, who you are, what you do, and basically where you came from. Are you a local El Pasoan originally?
I am a fourth generation commuter. My great grandparents actually met in the Chamizal neighborhood on the US side 100 years ago. And long story short, they moved to Juarez so they could buy a house. You know, back then, this is post Jim Crow, lots of redlining going on, and things were not affordable to them here. So they moved to Juarez so they could have a house to raise their children. And it's actually the house that I grew up in. I was raised by my grandparents and my mom, who's a single mom. And we commuted to El Paso every day. So I would go to public school and she would go to work. She was a low-wage worker. And so I am a fronteriza in that sense, that I grew up on both sides of the border.
That's really interesting. So you actually lived in Juarez for quite a while when you were growing up. Was the kind of a dynamic of what you saw there very different from the dynamic that you see here? And what were the influences back in the day?
Absolutely. Thank you for asking that. You know, I was born in 1976. So when I started going to school, it was in the early 80s. And I really credit my social justice work to having been raised in Juarez by people who are very much Mexican, because Mexico is, to this day, is still very honest about poverty and very honest in some ways even about racism, much more than the US, right? So I knew what poverty was, not only because my mom and I struggled financially, but I also understood my own privilege and the fact that there were children who were working while I was, you know, trying to go to school. And so back, if you remember traveling on any of the Mexico bridges, children would sell trinkets and newspapers and things, and they were my age. And so I understood at a very young to do something about injustice the rest of my life. So I really appreciated the fact that my grandparents read the newspaper. Again, Mexico is very, I think, transparent about corruption and about just inequality. It's hard to hide it because it is so widespread. And so that my eyes were opened up to that. In El Paso, I think it's different. If you live in the suburbs and you go to a, you know, quote, good school, you may never see someone who is struggling, who relies on the bus to get by, who works really hard jobs. But I didn't have that luxury. I was exposed to all of that.
I think it's interesting because I myself also kind of ran into the same dynamic. We moved from California when we were very young in here into El Paso. And I remember going to a private school, being lucky enough because my parents, you know, financially were stable enough to send us to private schools. And I remember visiting our family members in Juarez. And when we went, we would actually see the children selling chicles and cleaning the windows. And I used to remember that, you know, kind of seeing the separation, yet the paralleling of myself within the children themselves and me going to not ever have to wash windows and things of that nature allowed me to kind of move forward in a way that maybe they might not have been able to. And I think it's interesting that you took that opportunity to kind of do what you were doing today. So did you study here in El Paso as far as your high school and your college career is concerned?
I did, for high school, I went to Burgess High School, graduated in 1994, and then I went to Brown University and I graduated in 1998 with a degree in environmental studies. And then I was a first class of the new ethnic studies concentration. So I had 2 concentrations. And then I came home for a couple of years, did environmental work, and then went to UT Austin for law school.
And law school was something that you always wanted to do, or were you focused on the environmental thing first, and then all of a sudden, boom, you were thrusted into something that was completely different? What's the story there? Was there anybody there that kind of helped push you or nudge you into this new thing?
No, law school was never something I pondered, because when I was in college, I mean, I ended up going to I'm very lucky to get into Brown, and I focused on environmental studies because I grew up loving nature, and then both of my grandparents died in their early 60s from cancer. So to me, the environment was always these two things, right? The natural world and the human world, and the fact that when they're polluted, there's no protecting ourselves from that. And so when I was at Brown, I worked at different nonprofits. I really thought I was going to end up doing some sort of social justice work. I was then chosen to be an Andrew W. Mellon Fellow, and that was supposed to get me into a PhD program. As you know, to this day, there are still not enough numbers of people of color who are teaching in colleges. And so that's what the Andrew Mellon Fellowship was about. I had 3 years to go into graduate programs. And when I started to apply, I realized that I really wanted to be in the trenches. I didn't want to be in a classroom. And so I started to look at dual programs, and then with law schools and policy schools, and then ended up just saying, I'm going to go to law school. And the big trigger for that wasn't so much mentorship as it was that when I was in El Paso for those 3 years, I was doing outreach work on environmental pollution, especially air pollution. And I got to sit in on a lot of meetings where they were very lopsided. It was mostly the business entities in El Paso that had a huge say in policy implementation and policy design. And we were blaming individuals, right? So my programs were about educating people about reducing exposure to air pollution, but also driving less and using, switching their lawnmowers and things like that, which I think are very important. But we know that the biggest numbers and the biggest impact that we have are decisions made by corporations. And in El Paso, that's the refinery, El Paso Electric, and Asarco. And back then, Asarco was still in operation. And so I was like, what is going on here? Like, no one talks about environmental justice. No one talks about how these corporations are complicit in the pollution. And so I said, I need to go to law school. I need to push back and figure out how to make some effective change. And so that was really that was the impetus for that. I didn't grow up around lawyers. I had 2 uncles who were doctors in Mexico, but no one in my family has gone to law school either here or in Mexico. So it was just, to me, it became like everything else in my life, an end to a means.
I think that's very interesting. Our show is called Creative Thinkers. Creatively speaking, do you think that through all of these avenues that you have had, or that you have been given, do you think that you have used your creativity in a positive way as far as, I don't know, the environment or your education is concerned? And how is it helpful, I think, creativity, thinking outside the box?
Yes, and it's interesting because my house is like a little museum. I have a lot of art. I did a children's book with an illustrator, so I have a strong appreciation for artists. I'm not an artist. I do write. Some of it's been creative, but I think that for me, the way that I feel like I use my creative skills the most is with storytelling, and that is a crucial.
In which way?
In work, in how I talk to my clients, how I talk to opposing counsel, how I talk to courtrooms. I've been helping right now as part of one of my responsibilities is overseeing younger attorneys. And often they'll skip from A to Z, and I'm like, no, we need to talk about this human being that you are representing. What exactly happened to them, and what will happen to them if they lose? So let's go back to that conversation. Let's go back to the power play between those 2 people. Set the stage for the court and for like the transcript, right? Because often we have to appeal our cases. And I talk about things, in a case that we're dealing with now, that's going to hearing tomorrow, we have the seller, the buyer, and the house. I said the house is its own character. How are you going to talk about that house and what it means to people and the evolution of it? And so for me, it's really important that we whatever profession you have, that you think about, why it is that you're doing what you're doing, and how do you imbue, interest and importance into certain issues. And so that's one way that I try to do, but also in just being creative. For us is, I work at Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid. So I do
Right.
poverty law. My clients are by definition low income.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to think outside the box every single time, because I tell my clients, you're not gonna necessarily win if you don't win by winning, and you don't lose by losing every time. So I could win in court, get you a great judgment, but you may not get your house because the house is not a part of the remedies I can get you. So if you want the house, we need to be creative. How do we get that house? What do we need to give up in order for you to keep the house? And so those are the kinds of things that I feel like we're constantly negotiating and trying to find solutions that are practical, that are fair, and are doable. Because that's really what you want, is to have something that you can walk away with that is a success.
At the end of the day, of course. I think the way that you stated it, the connection and the way that you use creativity through storytelling. I've watched, I don't know how many television shows based on law, and I don't think that I had ever thought that the storytelling that they create within their minds and the way that they present it is part of being creative. And I really like the fact that you make that correlation between the two, because when we as viewers of our show and of whatever we're watching at the moment start to make those connections, then we can start bringing what we've learned from that show and start connecting it to our own lives. So in your life, you did something very interesting last year during the whole COVID thing. And by the way, we are still during this COVID pandemic, so we're recording from our homes right now. That's why we're sitting here on our Teams meeting. But what was it that you did last year that really brought you to the attention of most of the people here in El Paso?
So last year in 2020, and really in late 2019, I decided to run for mayor of the city of El Paso.
Wow.
And I, spoiler alert, I did not win. I did not make it into the runoff. I did come in third. We had 6 candidates, and I was about 6,000 votes away from Mayor DeMargo. And so he and Oscar Leeser made it into the runoff. Oscar Leeser won the mayoral race. Mr. Leeser has been mayor before. Mr. Margo was the incumbent. So it was an uphill battle, but I would do it all over again. It was a really fantastic experience. And I wish that I had, of course, won. We had incredible support from the community. And if I had won, I would have made history, because we've never had a Latina, Mexican-American, Chicana as our mayor in our city's 150-year history, which I think is shameful, because there have been some incredible Chicanas who have run in the past, in the recent past, and they have not won.
We have had a female for mayor.
Yes.
If I'm not mistaken.
Susie Azar.
Susie Azar, that's
Susie
exactly
Azar.
right.
Yeah.
But I'm glad that you brought up that point. But let's talk a little bit about that, the whole Chicano movement and how it's important for the dynamic of El Pasoans being a border city. What is your point of view on that?
I grew up in the 80s and 90s, and there weren't role models for us. The civil rights movement had sort of, waned a little bit, and there was more economic success for a lot of people and things. And so it was not a rallying time around Chicano rights, Chicana rights, identity, politics. And I think that I always had an understanding of injustice because of the way I was raised and the things that I was exposed to. And when I went to college, it was like, oh, finally, I get to talk about racism and sexism and homophobia and like all of these things that I had grown up learning at home, but and talking about at home. But in El Paso, it was like we don't talk about those things. And so I made sure during our campaign that we did talk about it, that we do address the fact that we have a lot of systemic racism still in our community, and the fact that we had this horrific mass shooting that was motivated by racism, yes, was horrific, and it's a hate crime and it should be prosecuted as such, but we cannot say that is the only example of racism in our community. We see the remnants of the Reconstruction era in our barrios to this day. The way that we really have to look at development programs, especially downtown and in Segundo Barrio, Duranguito, the Chamizal, Valverde, and see them for what they are. And they are basically a continuation of racist politics from 100 years ago that we still have not fully come to peace with. You know, people will say all the time, you know, El Paso is 83% Latinx. And most of that's Mexican American. We have some Salvadorians, we have some Dominicans, we have some Panamanians, and other Central Americans, as well as other groups. But we also have about 5% of African Americans. Right. And so, but yet if we look at people who are in power and who have, you know, in some most of the time, best jobs, they're Anglo, they're white. And so you have to wonder, like, why is that we're perpetuating these power structures 150 years after our foundation, and the fact that we were founded by Mexicans, Mexican Americans as well. But our history isn't preserved, it's not celebrated. And we also see that in the way that our economy is driven and by who it's driven.
Of course, economy is very important here in our region, but we are at the lower level, of course. I'm sure that's one of the topics that you spoke about while you were running for mayor. I heard we actually went to an event here at the school where they talked a little bit about how we lag not just behind economically, but in education. Was that something that you talked about? And how important is that? Because part of creative thinking, I think, from every aspect, from mathematics all the way over into history, for example, we have to constantly be thinking creatively. How important is education in our region as far as for us to lift ourselves up?
I mean, education, the reason that my mom and I commuted every day to El Paso, which was a huge sacrifice back then. I mean, we were getting up at 5 a.m, you know, for me to go to daycare so she could make it to work on time by 7 a.m. I mean, it was a huge sacrifice. There was so much traffic, there was so much energy that was wasted. But we did that because even though she was a US citizen, she had been educated in Mexico and she didn't speak English fluently. And so she said, I want you to have those opportunities. You'll have better jobs. You won't be working at a garment factory like me. Right. And so we know that education in this country is the best pathway to economic prosperity for a family. What we see now, I see great improvements at at certain school districts like SISD and Isleta. I think that they've done a lot to invest in their students. There are some issues that I'm concerned about with those school districts. But then there's also, EPISD is our biggest school district, and it has been embroiled in scandal after scandal. And we've actually supported the Familias Unidas del Chamizal, in filing complaints and lawsuits against the school district for discrimination, for closing down schools in the barrios, for not, and then what we've seen through the pandemic is that a lot of those children and their parents have fallen through the cracks because a lot of those parents are essential workers, had to rely on, remote learning, which was sometimes spotty because they don't have great Wi-Fi. One of the things that I talked about during the campaign was and now Governor Abbott is talking about it, is broadband access and having internet for everyone, and seeing that as important as electricity, as important as water right now. It is extremely important for our communities to be connected, especially when they have young learners at home that are having to learn remotely. And so there's a lot of need in our educational system in terms of just basic access to good education, but also in terms of the cultural programming that we do and the anti-racism work that we can do through our schools, which has always been an uphill battle in Texas. Our history has been very one-sided, and you see that come through the legislature all of the time. That Republicans want to keep out ethnic studies, they want to keep out Mexican American studies from schools, and that is detrimental because then that's why we repeat the cycle. And also, I believe that's also in part why so many students are lured by good paying jobs in law enforcement, and in the oil and gas, industry, because they don't understand the history of oppression in our community by those types of jobs and industries. And for them, it's immediate. When you're poor, survival is immediate. And so couple that with the fact that we're not providing good paying jobs that don't require so much risk and oppression. And then we also don't educate students to feel empowered to say, I don't want to do that. I don't want to be complicit. I can't, in understanding that good people working for bad industries or bad government get drowned out.
Was that one of the reasons why you ran? Try to get away from whoever is doing these things and pulling it over into what you're thinking about?
Absolutely. I think it's especially when it comes to
excuse me.
Jobs are important. I am grateful that I've had access to good jobs. They did not pay very well. I've been a legal aid lawyer for 16 years, and it did not pay very well, but I had loan repayment assistance, I've had health care, and I have a retirement plan. And so I also was, I'm not ambitious financially. And so that also helped that I am not, I don't need a huge house. I don't need a huge car. And as an environmentalist, I am very concerned about us continuing to invest in industries that are polluting. So the plan to expand I-10, for instance, right, making the highway bigger, it's not to alleviate passenger traffic like the cars that you and I drive. It's to facilitate semi-traffic, and it's to facilitate the Amazon warehouse in Horizon, as well as the TJ Maxx warehouse on Boeing, and all these other warehouse type of jobs. And so while that might be a driver to the economy, there's going to be an environmental impact. We also know that those jobs, the warehouse jobs, stand to be, to be extinct if more and more of those jobs are automated and are replaced. People are replaced by robots in warehouses. Think about the forklift. The forklift replaced a lot of people, decades ago. And so these are not jobs that are going to continue to grow. They're actually going to probably scale down in terms of who they employ. In terms of truck drivers, I have family members who have been truck drivers. It is a lot of my clients are truck drivers. It is a very difficult profession. It does have health consequences. It is dangerous, and it contributes to our pollution, but it pays well. And so I don't blame them. I blame us for not providing better opportunities, and for not striving to provide our primarily, a community that's primarily of color, opportunities that are really going to be good for them, their families, their health, and their environment. How many garment workers now have health issues? How many factory workers now have to deal with carpal tunnel issues, with kidney issues because they didn't have enough bathroom breaks? I've heard people, one of our campaign staffers, her dad's a doctor, Dr. Blandon, Pedro Blandon, and he says, I have a lot of teachers. He's a kidney doctor, and he's like, I have teachers who have kidney disease because they didn't go to the bathroom enough. Like simple things like that we need to realize that when it comes to so many of our professions, we have been asking people to sacrifice their bodies. And then when we live in a community that doesn't have healthcare as abundantly as it should, and we still don't have Medicare for all, that is a problem. That's a huge problem for people. So I do want us to start thinking long-term about economic solutions.
Absolutely. And I think that's something that I've spoken with a lot of people about, to continue to do that. And I'm glad that I get the opportunity to work at the El Paso Community College, because when I get the opportunity to teach individuals how important it is for us to gain knowledge and to have the opportunity to learn, I think then something clicks in their head. You know, a lot of the students sometimes come in and they're just kind of saying, well, I'll take a couple of classes, but really what I want is a job. But then they start to notice that there's others that are kind of going towards a specific goal. You know, I'm going to go towards nursing, and then I'm going to transfer over into UTEP, and then I'm going to be a nurse, and then I'm going to whatever else comes after that. But then they begin to focus, and then that influence helps the students move forward. And that's why I think it's so important. Can you give us one last thing that you can talk about? We've got about 1 more minute left.
Mhm.
How, a message that you can send to our viewers?
Well, in a minute, I think, ooh, this is hard. Sorry. I have to edit this.
Sorry to cut it short, but
Yeah, no, it's okay. I think one message would be to just become more observant. Become more observant, and you know, I don't want to just have people register to vote. I want them to actually vote. But
right,
between elections, I want them to look at city council meetings. You can now listen to them on YouTube. Look at the commissioners' meetings. Look at school board meetings, and really start to pay attention and to become active throughout the year. Watching local news is very important. Reading the local newspapers is really important, especially the alternative ones and the
right,
nonprofit ones, because you know, we cannot spend all of this energy on campaigns.
right.
The issues are on the ballot, and there's an election every single day. And that's how you have to think about it. That every day someone is making a decision that affects your life and affects your bottom line. And if you are not involved, and if you're not sending letters and making phone calls and staying informed, you're going to be rolled over and you're going to be ignored. And so that would be my one message, is to stay engaged every single day, not just when elections come, but of course, when elections come, get involved, volunteer for campaigns, learn more about the issues, and hold people accountable.
So have your voice heard, I think, is what I'm getting from that, because
Yes.
when your voice is heard, then things begin to change, which I think, again, is a very, very important thing for us to do. I want to thank you for taking your time today to talk to us a little bit about who you are, the types of ideas that go through your head on a day-to-day basis. And I want to say that it is women like you that start to make changes in our world. So thank you very much.
Thank
so,
you.
Thank you. I wanted to say to everybody, please come back. We have our show periodically here throughout the semester. So thank you very much for joining us. My name is Miguel Valenzuela, and Creative Thinkers.